Hello, Melissa.
Hello, Sarah.
How are you?
I'm fantastic on this first day of spring.
I know. I'm wearing a daffodil sweatshirt, and the daffodils are starting to come up and peek their little heads up out of the ground here in Northeast Connecticut, which I won't ask you about.
I'm happy for you. I'm happy that that's your experience. I will say that in my part of the world, on the west coast of Newfoundland, we're in a spring mindset, even if Mother Nature hasn't caught up. But I'm definitely feeling spring-like as much as you look spring-like this evening.
Definitely. We're thinking spring. I have 2 books right now out of the library. I got 2 interlibrary loan books, which, it's a little bit of pressure.
Yeah,
because 2 books and you got to get them back on time.
that's right.
But I finished one and I have a next one to begin. And that one is like a very slim volume. It's only like, I think 185 or 195 pages. So
You'll
I'm going
cruise
to get
through
it.
that.
I'm going to get it in. No problem.
I also have a book out of the library. I have Romantic Comedy by Curtis Sittenfeld because you had recommended this author to me and her collection of short stories that came out just this winter, February of 2025. And because it was so current, I wasn't able to get a copy. But since I was in that S section of the stacks, I saw Romantic Comedy there. And I've certainly seen a lot about that book. So I picked that one up. And that's what I'm working my way through right now. Thank goodness for these public libraries, eh?
Seriously. Yeah. And it was Show Don't Tell was the collection of short stories by Curtis Sittenfeld that I read and really loved. Maybe it's going to make an appearance on one of our upcoming episodes. But that, once again, just like Intermezzo, was one of those like super new books. And it was on the new release shelf. And I thought, I've seen her name before. I'm going to pick this up. And I was really glad I did. And I hope you enjoy Romantic Comedy. And I hope that we talk about her and her work sometime soon.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm sure between the two of us, we've also got probably a healthy portion of kids' books out from our respective libraries at this point too. I feel like I keep saying library, like that second that R sound is not it's not following through for me. The library.
We do love our local libraries, so much so that we just had the pleasure of appearing on a podcast for my local library, the Killingly Public Library. We were on the KPL Lit Talk podcast, chatting with library staff members Claudette and Kim. We had a lovely time, and we kind of wanted to share it with folks.
We got to share a lot about reading and all things book related and how much we love the library, but then also how we've all kind of transferred that into podcasting and a love of podcasting. So it was a really fun chat. And yeah, you can listen to it right now. We're going to flow right into that episode directly from our podcast channel, but you can also check out the KPL Lit Talks channel on Spotify and listen to all of their other episodes spanning back for a number of years.
That's right. Yeah, they've been at it for a while. And they were really lovely, gracious hosts. And we hope you enjoy, and we will see you soon.
In today's podcast, it's Could Read, Should Read, and Must Read. I'm Claudette Stockwell, the Library Director.
I'm Kim Mather, Teen and Adult Services Librarian.
And we have not one, but 2 special guests from the podcast, Could Read, Should Read, and Must Read. We have Sarah Wolfberg and Melissa Halford with us today. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
This is super exciting, podcasting to podcasting. So I have to know a little bit about the both of you. So whichever one wants to start first, just give us a little, how did you end up in podcast land?
Okay, I'll start. So I am Sarah Wolfberg, and you will know me on this particular broadcast because of my very hoarse voice. I don't normally sound like this, so it's a little bit more of a pleasurable listening experience than what it will be today for me in particular. But yeah, so I'm Sarah Wolfberg, and I'm one half of our dynamic duo behind Could Read, Should Read, Must Read. And I live in Northeast Connecticut, which of course is where the Killingly Public Library is also located. And I am a proud partner in this podcast. I have a passion for books. I studied English literature as an undergraduate, and for my master's degree, which is how I met Melissa. And I'm sure we'll go into detail about our story as partners. But yeah, we've been doing this particular podcast for about a year and a half now. We're getting on a year and a half, and it's all about our passion for books, and recommending books to one another, and bantering about books. So that's a little tidbit about me in a nutshell. So, Melissa.
Yeah, I love this. It feels like one of those crossover specials, when you're a kid and it's like the Smurfs were on the Flintstones or something. So it's like the merging of our podcasts. It's awesome. Yeah, so I'm coming to you today through the magic of the internet from Newfoundland, the island in the North Atlantic, the 10th province of Canada. And so this is where Sarah and I met on this island. And when we were both going to school here at the time, it was in about 2007, 2008. And so obviously living in two different countries, two different parts of the world, busy lifestyles, podcasting seemed like the most obvious way for us to keep in touch. So we've sort of used our friendship and our interest in talking about books to craft the podcast, but it's also just selfishly a great way for us to keep in touch with one another and have lots of good chats together.
Sorry.
And I have to say, from listening to you guys, that I can tell you put a lot of time and effort into discussing your books. So what is that like when you're discussing a book that you haven't actually read?
Well, we thought that we would use that model to kind of try to make the podcast more accessible for a wider audience. So if the other person hasn't read the book, you're forced to kind of describe it more fully, and not give it away too much either, right? To make sure that the other person's still kind of maybe inspired to read it. So it's a good way to sort of make sure that we give a fuller picture of the book, so that if a listener hasn't read it, they're also still able to like relate as well to the episode. But then if someone has read it, then they can connect to the episode as well. We do, I don't want to use the word cheat, but we do some preliminary research, very basic, like even if we haven't read the book, we'll always read a few reviews of it just to make sure we have somewhere to take the conversation. And we do kind of share themes with each other first. So we're actually in the process of getting ready for our next episode, and we kind of have this like shared Google Doc where I'll kind of throw in some themes and flesh it out a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we don't do that, but I'm wondering if it's something we should consider moving forward. Especially because Kim and I are very great at reading books and then being like, what exactly was that even about?
Yes. Yeah, they're very relatable for sure, because I think especially if you're reading a lot of books, you're going through them quickly and you're moving on to another book. And then when you think back, they can kind of blur together and trying to like pick out the details. And I think certainly with the experience of recording this podcast, it really helps us think about a book a little bit differently in terms of like, I've read a book and I'm like, would I want to talk about this on the podcast? Would I want and they're not always super strong recommendations, right? Because the whole premise is could read, should read, must read. And the idea behind that is some books are could reads, like, you could read them. They're okay.
Yeah.
Should read as in like, I think you should read this. This was pretty good. Or a must read of like, this will change your life.
Yeah.
I had an epiphany while reading this and I want to share that. And so, we're always looking at that, I think, and it's helping us engage with a book on a little bit more of a different level. And it helps you remember it because you're more likely to maybe put a little sticky note and think about it that way. And, I think too, this is all a product of our friendship and how much we like to talk with one another. And I mean, that's books, but also like broader kind of cultural experiences, film, television, music, politics. But, I think the way we look at this podcast is, how would we talk with one another? How would we recommend a book or discuss a book that we might want the other person to read so that after they've read it, we can have an even fuller conversation? And so I think that's kind of boiled down within the podcast itself.
And because we are coming to this from the experience of having met in grad school, and neither Sarah nor I, and I don't mean to speak for you, Sarah, but we're not academics, even though, we came at it from this academic experience. And one of the classes that was particularly formative for us, I think, it was a Canadian fiction course. And the task every week was to read a novel and write a 500-word, like just kind of pick something, just say, okay, this is like one theme, one implication of this reading that I experienced. So, don't overdo it, but don't underdevelop it either. And so we kind of almost see this podcast as a version of that as well. It's kind of like influenced by that particular class, because I totally, Claudette, relate to that experience of like, oh, that book was amazing. And someone's like, why? And you're like, I don't know. It just was like, you just got to trust me on this. But then it's like when you actually are forced to put pen to paper or like fingers to the keyboard kind of thing to articulate that to someone, you either go, maybe that actually wasn't that good of a book, and I just was feeling it in that moment. Or sometimes this happened in our last episode. I was like ready to go in with a should read, because the culminating question of every episode is, we ask the person, is this a could read? Is this a should read? Or is this a must read? And I was like ready to go with my should read. But the more that we talked about it, I was like, oh my gosh, am I going to make like a game time decision and call this a must read? Because I was like convincing myself more of the merits of this particular book as I was explaining it to Sarah and all of its key points. So it's a really nice way to just kind of like expand the reading experience, right? Like you love those moments of reading, but then you get to kind of like continue living in that world a little bit, play with what's happening in it, flesh it out a bit more to kind of prolong that experience.
So are you like with the Post-its? My daughter is famous for that. She is like with a journal next to her, writing down her favorite quotes and all. And I'm like, oh wow, okay.
Did you see those Post-its?
So I'm done. So yes, that answers that question. You are definitely taking notes throughout. That probably does help in the memory of the book.
It's funny because I kind of go at it a little bit differently. If I've read the book, thought about it, processed it, and thought, I'm going to talk about this on the podcast, I will then go back and put my sticky notes. And I actually write on the sticky note, because a lot of times we will ask each other to read quotes from the particular book that we're reading. And so I'll go back afterwards because I like to think about it as a whole, because sometimes I read something and it doesn't necessarily stick out at once as I'm reading it. It's only in retrospect, I'll think back and I'll be like, that one section, that character said this, or this particular paragraph, and it will stick in my mind, but it's like chapters later after I've already closed the book. So I think there's so many different ways of going at it,
Do you find it hard to come up with questions and discuss a book that only one of you is reading and to kind of interview the other one about the book?
Well, this is going to reveal a little bit about us in that we edit a lot of our episodes heavily.
Yes.
Okay.
So, all of our recordings. So we have two approaches, right? Because we also recorded for TV at a local studio in the city where I live. So those episodes tend to come out raw, like they're just, what is said. There's no going back sort of thing. But the audio only episodes that we just do together in much a format like this, when we extract the audio, we slice and dice them a bit. So there's definitely moments where we'll kind of say, ooh, let's try that again, or we're going to cut this. And we're also very upfront with each other in a sort of, it's not really rehearsed, but or maybe scripted, I guess, that we'll say like, make sure you ask me about this character, or maybe you lead into this. So we'll kind of have a plan for it, just so that it does go relatively smoothly in the final product, and we can cut some stuff out. But I actually find it not too hard to figure out what to ask, because I'm curious, right? Like it's a story that I want to know more about. And I am sort of like vetting it, like, will I read this one, or is it not really my type? Because as much as our tastes do overlap, and there's definitely books that for Sarah and I are like shared must reads, we also read really different things from one another, don't we, Sarah?
We definitely do. Yeah. Yeah. And so I think with that, it it really allows us to, engage in we might think of questions that the other person, isn't necessarily hasn't prepared us for, but it just naturally kind of comes up. And I will say, not to throw myself under the bus, but I feel like one of Melissa's real talents is asking questions, really thoughtful questions. Like, it's funny, we were on CBC radio in Canada for our university, had like a Valentine's Day little initiative to kind of talk about how so many different types of relationships come out of that university experience. And so with us, our friendship and our podcast, we ended up kind of getting highlighted. And they asked us, like, what's something about the person? And that was my automatic thing, because from the second I met Melissa and we were sitting in classes together, that Canadian literature course, I was always really, really like impressed with the fact that she could just think on her feet and ask a really thoughtful question about a text that we're just kind of coming into with, raw and blind. And so that's kind of continued on in the podcast. She's really great. So I find like she makes it easy when I'm the one that's talking about a book, because like she just automatically has questions. I might give her a couple like notes and bullet points of like, make sure I want to talk about this theme, but she just naturally will come up with a lot of really great questions and make me think about it and engage with it in a different way too.
It comes from years of being very nosy.
Do you find that you are reading things outside of your typical picks?
Yeah, I think so. And we've also kind of tried to set goals for ourselves. And it also kind of drives a more sort of sustained conversation in the podcast as well. So like last year, one of my goals was about like entering into a larger conversation with our listeners. And this year it's about like saving money, such as by using a library. Shout out to you guys are from Sarah's local. So that's like special stuff. But it's definitely pushed me. Like we also had a summer reading challenge last summer. It was like a bingo card format. And I kept joking that like I came up with the majority of the squares on the bingo card and then struggled to find books to fill them. It's like I should have just like, had a bit better planning in place. But it drove me to kind of say, okay, well, what will I read as a translation? I never read translations. Or what will I read that was a bestseller, that isn't like sort of obscure, that kind of thing. So it definitely opens sort of a lot of different categories. And then because people are listening and we're recommending books to them, they're recommending books to us, whether it's just because they think we'll like them or they want us to do an episode about them. So yeah, I'm definitely in my case anyway, finding opportunities to read a lot of things that I wouldn't normally have.
Yeah. And I also feel like, it's easy because book clubs are so popular now. You've got your Reese Witherspoon's book club and Read with Jenna and of course Oprah. And so I think sometimes it's really easy, especially on social media, like you have these buzzed about books that are brand new. So it's like, you don't want to fall into a trap where you're only reading books. It's great to engage with new authors and new texts that are coming out and are current. But at the same time, like, you don't want to be just limiting yourself to just something that's coming out in like 2025. And so one of the nice things about that summer reading challenge even was like one of the squares was read something that was written at least 25 years ago. And so, and then I think in a weird way, because we have this podcast, I know at least I feel a little bit of a responsibility to make sure that my reading isn't just limited to one particular genre, because that gets boring and stale after a while. Like you want to challenge yourself. You want to be reading different types of stories in different formats. I mean, one of our shared reads was a graphic novel, which for me, that was the first graphic novel that I ever read was that particular book.
And we both gave it a must.
We did. And the book is titled Ducks by Kate Beaton, which I believe came out in 2022, 2023. But it was a must read for both of us. And she's a Canadian writer and artist. And so that was great. It introduced me to a genre that I really had never explored before.
We did that. Kylie, who's not with us today, she's usually the romance lover. I'm the psychological thriller, and Kim is historical fiction. And usually, when we are just podcasting about books, we're just talking about what we've read, whether we liked it. And so this last year, that's what we did. We were like, okay, we're going to recommend something from our favorite, and we're all going to read it. And that was actually really fun because we could all, because we didn't do any homework, maybe in the future.
Although
Little
nothing
Post-its.
from my list got used.
Nothing
yet.
what
It's still
happened to
waiting
that?
for me?
I'm blaming all that on Kylie, because she's not here.
Yeah.
But it was really fun because we were able to kind of come at it, and Kylie is very good. She is the note taker of our group. She's the one who is preparing if she is doing a podcast with our guests. She has all those questions for you. But man, we read that The House Guest by Frida McFadden, and she tore that apart in like 3 seconds.
Yes.
She had like a million questions, and she was like, but what about this and this? And we were like, oh, okay. All right, great. So I can see where that's super helpful and fun. And yeah, reading different things gets you out of, your same, like, this is the only thing I read.
And we've started having guests on our show as well. It took us a few times to try to, get that sort of comfort level too with recording. And we're so fortunate that we have lots of classmates that we're still in touch with. So we felt comfortable kind of starting out by having them on as guests. And we sort of think of our guests now as like content experts, even kind of like bringing them on to talk about, like you said, about a genre instead of a specific book. So like our Valentine's Day episode was a smut episode because that's super, hot and popular right now. And Sarah and I are not reading a lot of smut.
No.
So we needed to bring in the experts. And we're talking about maybe doing something related to like self-help books that are really popular, but just not something like we do always recognize that we as parents, as professionals and so on, like there's only so many hours in a day. And it's difficult. You might, that TBR is always growing and you want to be reading all the time, but there's only so much you can read. So you need to be a little bit choosy. I'm not the type to sit down with a piece of smut, but maybe our listeners want to hear about that. So we kind of like incorporate the guests as well.
I will have to say that for romances, I don't usually dig down that road, but with people enjoying them, I'm like, I got to give them a try. And I mean, if they're super smutty, I'm not a fan, but I have to admit there is something nice at the end of a stressful day to just be able to kind of, transport yourself into this land where you're like, oh, and I hope they get together.
Yeah.
It all ends happily. And you're like, no one got killed in this one.
Yeah, it's funny on that particular smut episode. That was something that, because we had two guests who are very good friends and both lovers of smut, but both of them agreed that they were comfort reads for them. And so I think the point that you bring up about it's nice at the end of a stressful day to be able to kind of sink yourself into something that you're not going to have to think too hard about and is not going to kind of like engage, your anxiety that's maybe already at a 10. And I think too, if we're reading the books and it's outside of our comfort zone, like a self-help book, like the chances of me reading a self-help book just to read it for the podcast, it's just not, I don't really have the drive to do it. But if we have a guest on and they really get a lot out of a self-help book, I feel like that's the best way to engage because you're talking, like Melissa said, with like a content expert. It's someone who really enjoys that type of writing. And I feel like they're more likely to sell you on something and maybe grab your attention than if you're just kind of forcing yourself to read something just for the sake of it. So I think it's a really happy medium between us just talking about the books that we like and going a little outside of our comfort zone, but then also being able to welcome people in to shed light on something that we really don't have a lot of experience with.
So for each episode, do you each read one book or do you read more than one?
So this is another beauty of the, this feels like a promotional session for Google, but another Google Doc exists that is like our schedule, and it's color coded and it's mapped out like in September until December and then January to June, because we do want to bring people onto the show so much. And again, we're busy and that sort of thing. And so we like to have an episode come out every second Tuesday. And we're also partnering with Rogers TV, which is like a Canadian TV consortium. I don't know what the word would be, corporation, I guess. So every other episode is a video episode, and then they're interspersed with these the audio only episodes that we do from home. So it's either one of us does a book, so either myself or Sarah, or we have a guest. So it's rare that we both read a book for an episode, but we also have, and I'll let Sarah talk more about these, but a little series that we kind of have like a sub-series within that same schedule of what we call book banter. And then there's even like a sub-series of that, which is called Book Banter After Dark.
Ooh.
So you could talk about those, Sarah, but they're a lot of fun, eh?
Yeah, the book banter, those are like the loosest episodes, I feel like, because usually it will only do it like maybe once, twice a year, maybe 3 times, like, and it's after, we've really accumulated a lot of reads, and then, picking out the ones that were shared reads. And I don't know that we're super picky about like making sure that there's like, a bunch of must reads and a couple of should reads and a couple of good reads. It's really like how we really feel about it. And sometimes we may imbibe a little bit. And that helps with kind of the conversation. And, one of the things that we love to do is reminisce about our time when we were in grad school together. And so that will kind of come up during those episodes. But I do feel like people like them because they do tend to have a lot of listeners. I don't know, like when we're looking at the breakdown of each episode and which ones got more listens and less listens, like I think maybe because we're laughing a lot during those, like they tend to be fun and lighthearted. And then the book banter after dark, certainly that smut episode was one of those. And, we have a lot of people that listen, and they might listen while they're driving their kids to school and so, some of those episodes we have to put like little kind of parental guidance warnings on those. But, we really are for the most part pretty PG, but those episodes just allow us to get a little bit looser than we normally would. So it's nice to have a balance.
How about books that you don't think anybody should read? Are those ever included? Because you've got could, should, and must, but there's never a like, no way kind of a.
Yeah, we all, it's tough because that when somebody has taken the time and the effort and the heart that it takes to put into writing a book, like you don't want to be insulting to someone. And not that every single author that we're releasing a podcast about is, tuning in and listening to us two ladies chat about the book, but those definitely tend to be more along the lines of like could reads. And so, we've talked about this on one of our book banter episodes, even so, is like, what is a could read? What is a should read? What is a must read? And it's a spectrum. So some of those, like, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this book, but maybe if you really like X, this might actually be your cup of tea, tends to fall in that could read. So they don't, I feel like we also have good taste for the most part. And so, we don't necessarily encounter a ton of books that were like, this was awful. But we may end up bringing up like a DNF, that we started and didn't get through. And we won't go into extreme detail about that, but it does come up because that's an experience that we all have as readers, right?
Sure.
Yeah, it is kind of funny. I think just in the sort of like secret society of readers that exists in the world, like there are tons of books that are bestsellers, classics, like people, have them tattooed on their bodies. They're so meaningful to them. And for you, it's just meh. Like it just doesn't speak to you. And I think that's part of the beauty of books, that some really speak to you and you connect with them. So like, we're always cautious to say, like Sarah mentioned, like, it was a good read for me. This isn't going to be a good read for everyone. We tend to not really bring up the ones that we really think are, not good. But the way I kind of think about it is like, you could read this, but you could read something else that you should read.
That's perfect, because for the most part, we don't either. I think, we've been podcasting for about 5 years, and maybe once or twice have we been like, and you can pass on this. For the most part, because I agree, everybody likes different things, but also if I wrote a book, it would kill me if someone was like, just put that back.
Yeah.
And also, like, you have to think about your audience, because there could be a book that they've read and maybe they're tuning in. Because I do this all the time. If I've read a book and I like really am thinking about it, I'm like, I want to see what other people are saying about this book. And so if somebody is like poo-pooing all over this book that you really loved, then it's kind of like, oh, I don't want to listen to them talk about anything else.
Yeah.
They didn't like this book that I had, a passionate response to. So.
Have you ever decided to read a book for the podcast, but because you couldn't get through it, it was just not your cup of tea, that you kind of switched gears and chose something else? Or do you just kind of plow through it?
I think that's when the book banters, there's in our back pocket, a little ace in the hole, that it's like, well, we'll just banter, because there's always something to talk about, or, you can just chat about books themselves, but also the experience of reading. Like, we did this whole thing one time about like, where's your favorite place to read, and it's like, oh, reading in a hammock, reading in a bathtub, reading in a rocking chair, like that. I think people who are readers can really relate to. It's like, oh, I love that feeling. Hot cup of tea, snowing outside, or like there's different moments, different formats of reading. So if ever we're really stuck and just haven't managed to get through, what we thought we might, we can betray the Google Doc schedule. It's really just a matter of, a click and change sort of thing to make sure that we can still, because that was something that we talked about, when we first started too, was like, let's give it a go, right? Like, let's just see how this goes. So in the beginning, we did these 3 teaser episodes was what we called them, just to kind of see if we had the chops for it, right? Because like the editing and the scheduling, and could we keep the discussions going and that sort of thing. So we did those 3 episodes and they were in December. So it was all holiday books and that kind of thing. This was in 2023. And then it was like, okay, well, let's keep going. And I think it was just partly maybe an unspoken rule between us. Like, we're going to keep doing this as long as we love it. And then we're not going to let it turn into something that we'd ever argue over or disagree, like, which is like, just, it's such a source of joy for both of us. And like, we're just constantly back and forth in text. Like, I just listened to that one again. Oh man, that was so funny when you said that. And like, we're very self-congratulatory. It's been excellent for our egos to have this show. But like, the minute that it would sort of turn into something that feels more like work, I think we'd probably sort of take a step back and go like, okay, maybe we're letting this take on a life of its own in a direction that we didn't really want to go. So, but for now, it's all just fun and games.
Yeah. And I also feel like the way that we've structured the schedule too is, it's not like we're releasing episodes every single week. We really do like 2 to 3 episodes a month. And then because we're taking turns reading books, there's not a lot of pressure on each of us to be, keeping up and reading a certain amount of books, so that, there is always something to talk about, and we have guests on. And so that also helps. And then, in the summer, we do kind of take a little bit of a break because it tends to be a really busy time with lots of travel and sports and all of that. And so that's where something like the Summer Reading Challenge was great, because we weren't necessarily putting out the same number of episodes over the course of the summer, but it just allowed us to still engage with the act of reading with the podcast and with other people in a really nice way. And one of the things that we did at the end of the summer when we were kind of starting to get back into our regular schedule is we ended up bringing on readers who had really engaged with that summer reading challenge and then had them talk about their experiences. And so that was another really nice way too. So because I hit a reading slump over last summer. Like I did really good through the spring, summer hit. And for some reason, I think I read a couple of like duds and like a little bit like downers like in a row. And then it just made me go, I just don't feel like reading right now. And it was really nice to have a little bit of a break, but also to know that we had this other thing going on that still was a part of the reading experience in the podcast, but not feeling like I have to read because I have to talk about a book that I've read. So,
and I think you brought up a great point there, because I do think that sometimes, especially readers that read books that are duds, and then they just think, I don't like to read. And as librarians, we're just like, you just haven't found the right book. And a lot of times that happens, at least with teens, or even, younger kids. If you just get them the right book, it changes their whole philosophy. And even as readers, it does happen. You do just get 2 or 3 or 4, or, you could go on with books that just they're just not doing it for you. And then you kind of do get kind of like in that slump where you're just like, that's been me so far this year. I'm like, I think I'm only 13 books in. Like, I'm just like, I don't know what's going on this year. Like, I'm just like, it's going to be April soon. I got to like find some books I'm enjoying or something.
13 sounds pretty healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. We're not like necessarily like a quantity. Like we definitely, that's one of the things that we've talked about a lot with our reading goals is, sometimes you get so caught up in the numbers game of it all that then it is easy to get into a slump because you do feel like you're behind, but all it takes is just like, okay, what am I really in the mood for? What's going to get me back? And, I have found from my own experience, like last year I had several like really thick, heavy books, we're talking like 600 pagers. And sometimes, that takes especially when you're working and if you're a parent or you're involved in a lot of other activities, it can take a while and you feel like you've been spending like weeks and weeks and weeks engaged in the same book. And I have definitely found that it's nice to kind of vary the length of the book so that if I'm reading a really, really thick book, then afterwards, like maybe do a 250 pager and then you fly through it. And then I feel like you can kind of get your momentum back because that was part of my struggle last year too. So.
And do you ever just read one book at a time or are you reading multiple books?
Well, Melissa, last year, definitely, one of our episodes we were talking about, the analogy I believe was pots on a stove, that she had many burners going because she not only different types of books, but different formats as well.
Yeah, I was all over the place. And then it started to get really stressful. Like I just felt like I needed to like start cluing up, like finishing them because they were just, it was like overwhelming for me. So yeah, my approach, generally speaking, is I always have an audiobook going and I always have like a paper book going. So I'm comfortable with 2, but then things just got out of control because I was like, we were doing a family read. Like sometimes like my kids and husband and I like will all read a chapter out loud to each other. So then that was kind of happening. And then I got a book from the library. And as librarians, if your book comes in, you got 5 days to come pick it up. I don't know what your policies are, but it's like, if you miss that window, it's going back to wherever it came from. So you get there.
Librarians and their rules were awful.
Yes, exactly. The strict librarian theme is a real one. So I did things got a little bit out of control there with those books. But
you managed though. You finished all 4 because it was 4, I believe, 4 at one time. And Claudette, going back to something that you were talking about before with young readers and like some of the struggles and we talk about this a lot because both of us have children, and we are such invested and passionate readers. And it was so important to our young identities and even obviously our adult identities I mean, Melissa and Tom met in grad school, our grad program, and over books, so obviously like really important to us as individuals and as friends. And we talk all the time about wanting our kids to be readers and wanting them to fall in love with books in the way that we fell in love with them. And I think Melissa has definitely like struck, gold with that because her kids are real avid readers. But what's been really interesting and kind of we've incorporated it into the podcast is like Melissa's daughter, her oldest child, is an avid reader, and she has come on the podcast actually twice. She was one of our summer reading challenge participants, and then recently she talked about the Hunger Games, and she also talked about, was it NPR? Is that what it was? NPR's like list of books. And she was talking in particular about like books for like youth, readers. And she had her own opinions about like what she would have chosen versus what was chosen and why she thought that way. So really interesting to engage with younger readers of like what appeals to them. And we've talked a lot about the idea of like the graphic novel genre. And like that tends to be something that kids gravitate towards. And like sometimes we can feel a little stuffy and stuck in our ways about like, well, that's not a real book. You know what I mean? But it is anything that keeps you read it, like I think for some people, like they wouldn't consider that. But, to be open-minded and to say, well, anything that gets you engaged with character and story,
yes,
that is your entryway, like that just opens up this whole world to you. So, certainly I know like Melissa's son has gotten into graphic novels and her daughter as well. And even my son, we just started reading Dog Man.
Nice.
And so I'm like, here we go. I read to him every night. He's only 6. He doesn't read for himself yet. He's starting a little bit. But yeah, like any way to kind of engage those young readers so that they can kind of have this relationship with books over the course of their lives is like something that we're like really kind of like focused on and thinking about.
I'm so glad you didn't stifle the children when they were looking to go to the graphic novels.
Yeah.
That's so important.
Yeah, that's one thing we do find, as public librarians, is that families will feel that way sometimes, and trying to. Right, exactly. And sometimes even like the anime, they're even harder to read because you're reading from the opposite side of the page, and you really have to have attention to detail to follow that story. And I think just sometimes parents, if you're old school, you think, well, if it's not no pictures, 100% words, and that's not really the case. So I'm glad that you guys recognize that as well. But as readers, you probably would. So.
Oh, yeah. And for us anyway, like, because a lot of those graphic novels that are targeted towards that sort of say 9 to 12 age group, they're in series.
Mm-hmm.
So they are excellent for kids because that decision making sometimes at the bookstore, at the library is like really can be kind of stressful. Like, so when you're like, well, you like Big Nate, so just get another Big Nate, like, and then they might get 2 or 3 so that they don't hit a reading slump because unlike for us as adults, it's like, okay, I'll just run over on my lunch break or whatever. We're in charge of that, like that process of procurement of books, whereas kids don't have that same ability. So when we're at the library, it's like, okay, get like 4 or 5, because the minute you finish that one, rather than fall into that reading slump, one is ready in the queue to go, it's right at their fingertips kind of thing. It's funny too, just going back to this whole reading slump thing. One of the things that we talked about in the summer reading challenge was rereading. And that's another thing people kind of turn up their nose at, right? Like you already read that book. Why are you going to read that again? As if we would only ever listen to a song that we liked once.
Yeah, right. That's a great point.
Yeah, it's a piece of art. You liked it, go back to it. And so if it's a book that you liked enough, reread it. Like it's a guaranteed book that'll get you out of that book slump. And making the connection with kids' books too. Sarah knows I do this every time. I like amalgamate titles and turn it into like one mate. It's like, dear God, hello, hello God, it's me, Margaret. Somebody help me.
I think, is it Dear God, It's Me, Margaret?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So that book, my daughter got it for her birthday last month. And, we did a little buddy read with it. We didn't read it aloud to one another because it talks about things that Val didn't want to read out loud with her mom in the room, kissing and periods and stuff. But, she would read it for whatever. And then when she'd go to bed, I'd grab it and I'd kind of always try to catch up to wherever she was, like in the book. And oh man, that was fun. Like, so both of us reading it at the same time, it was sort of like what is old is new again sort of thing. And seeing it through her perspective, like she was like, oh, I never trusted that friend right from the beginning anyway. Like she was like wise to it. So yeah, I think like what we're all kind of getting at too is like, reading is solitary, and those of us who are introverts like that, but then it's also an incredibly social experience too, right? Like making our friendship connections and like connections within our family with larger groups of readers, like the four of us on this screen right now. Like it really does bring people together and give this kind of common language too. It's the original meme.
And the great point you also brought up too is it's a great way for parents or caregivers to have awkward conversations with their children, because books give you that opening that maybe you don't want to talk about these awkward things, but you can because the book's doing it for you, and you can kind of delve into the through the characters' feelings so that nobody's feeling vulnerable. So I love to hear when parents read with their kids.
You're always at arm's length, right? So you're not actually talking about their friend at school and you're not calling out that friend. You're like that character in that book. Like, I don't know how I felt about that. When in actual fact, you're like, your friend did this to you. But you don't have to be too like targeted.
Well, I can just tell you guys are like super awesome. I'll probably be taking some cheat sheets from your podcast and moving forward and changing the way it is because we've been doing this for a long time, and we started where we were podcasting every single week, and we did that for many years.
Yes.
So we got to the point over just in this last year and a half where we're like, oh, we're kind of fizzling out a little bit, so this might give us some fresh air to start again.
Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
We've moved on to like just our commitment this year is to only do it twice a month, so kind of alleviate some of that pressure off of us having to keep coming up with content. And because we like talking with guests, if we've had some guests on like talking about their businesses, and we've had some come back, but it's sort of like, okay, like unless there's some businesses, we kind of feel a little bit like, oh, we're kind of in that podcast rut. So this was nice for us.
Oh, I'm so glad.
On that level, how do you see your podcast moving forward and changing in the future, or if not at all?
Oh, we have so many plans, so many big ideas, some of which are, pie in the sky. Like, we're super pleased that over the course of the last year, we took it to TV. So that was exciting. And that also we stayed consistent like throughout the last year. And we've noticed that some people engage with us on social media and never listen to the podcast and vice versa. My best case scenario, and Sarah's already like, I know where she's going with this. I love the idea of someday in the future, if we ever could, hosting like a reading retreat somewhere, and people would come and we would be, read quietly, but then also in the evening, basically like talk about books with delicious food. And then we would do a live podcast recording. Just again, the egos are very healthy at this point from the podcasting. People would flock to hear us live. But the idea of sort of, again, that sort of combination of the social part of reading and the introverted part of reading all sort of packaged in one event. That's my dream.
Oh,
I love it.
That sounds great.
And I think just like continuing to do it and to continue to love it, because it's so lovely that a year and a half in, I still love it. Like I look forward to when we're going to record. Again, like as I'm reading books, I'm thinking about like, oh, I think I might want to talk about this one with Melissa. Like, and I think, just continuing to have that creative outlet, continuing to have that connection with one another, to introduce people to different types of books, to engage with people about books. I think
so
it's
good.
just, it's beautiful. Like, I think when we were, 17 years ago, like sitting in a classroom together, like little did we know that we would still be talking about books, and how great is that? So
That is wonderful. Yeah. Any last questions, Kim?
No, I had one a second ago and I didn't write it down, so it's already gone from my head.
Well, we're just so happy that you welcomed us on here and allowed us to talk about our podcast. And we, as we mentioned before, both love our local libraries. We're both constantly going and engaging with our libraries and getting books. And it's such a wonderful resource for our communities. And it's a big part of our reading experience is engaging with libraries. So thank you very much.
Thank you for
Yeah.
being library lovers.
Yeah.
We wouldn't be here without library lovers. And thank you for your podcast. It really kind of is inspiring, and I love your concept. I think it's a great idea.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is awesome.
Thanks everybody for listening.
Catch you later.
Bye.
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 Bye.